Has the US dollar lost its luster? And is the dollar empire coming crashing down? The world is in a crisis it has not seen for 100 years. Some say we are already in World War III or a war to defend a democracy. I say a new multipolar, free and fair world is being born. Old assumptions about who rules the world and how they rule are changing. We should not panic, and on the Burning Archive, I offer you calm history to help you through the crisis. I focus on a big event from the multipolar world, connect to real stories of history, and share a fragment of the cultural heritage of the multipolar world. This week on the Burning Archive, I look at the threat to the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency. And how does that history return to the emergence or perhaps the re-emergence of a multipolar world and the end of the American century? They are the questions on today's Burning Archive.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.
I am Jeff Rich. I am an independent author and podcaster, and the Burning Archive podcast offers my unique perspective on stories of the multipolar world, history and its culture as a retired government official and lifelong student of history who is curious about all the world's cultural traditions of responsible statecraft. And in this episode, I do my best to bring together those skills as a government official and a historian to try to make sense of what is going on in the financial order of the world. What is going on about all this talk about the end of the US dollar's dominance of the world? So over the last few weeks, several countries, primarily the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have made decisions to reduce their use of the US dollar in trade and financial transactions. And the status of the US dollar, many people have speculated its status as the world's reserve currency may be under threat. The fear that the US dollar might lose its primacy as the world's currency has spilled over into mainstream news stories on American television, and there have been fears expressed that this change would weaken American power, weaken the American economy, and open the gates to the multipolar world, all those barbarians outside of America. For example, the influential conservative commentator Steve Bannon has produced a whole series of papers talking about the end of the dollar empire. Donald Trump has chimed in to say that the China might become the number one currency in the world, and that would be the biggest defeat in US history. But it's not just right-wing people in America. It's also from the Democrat Biden administration. The White House spokesperson has said that the use of national currencies rather than the US dollar was, and I quote, a violation of the rights of our citizens who rely on a stable dollar exchange rate on the world market. And of course, there have been a host of investment advisors. I think there's been an enormously popular YouTube video from the rich dad, poor dad guy, Robert Kiyosaki, speculating on the end of the US dollar, and all sorts of investment advisors pushing the panic button more or less hard. And of course, on the Burning Archive, podcast. I do not offer investment advice, and in any case, anyone who knows me would surely know that they should not ask me for investment advice anyhow. I offer calm history to help you sort through the different narratives that are being presented and told about the big issues of today. So let's have a look at this issue. Whether the US dollar is losing its status as the world's reserve currency, and what, in any case, does that really mean? What's the real history behind all of that? So, first of all, let's look at what a reserve currency actually is. So, a reserve currency is a foreign currency that a central bank or treasury holds as part of that country's formal foreign exchange reserves. And the bank uses those reserves to pay for economic shocks or to pay for imports, service debts, or to protect the value of the currency if and when there's some kind of speculation on it. And because many countries conduct their international trade in US dollars, it's generally perceived as the most secure currency and one in which most of the big debts that people have between countries are paid in. The International Monetary Fund actually recognises 8 major reserve currencies around the world, of which the dominant one is the US dollar. But the Australian dollar is actually formally recognised by the IMF as a reserve currency too, as is the Chinese renminbi, the euro, the pound sterling, the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc. But the key advantage of a reserve currency for the United States is that it sort of insulates America from the cost of its debt. It makes money relatively cheap because everyone needs to have US dollars. It keeps up the value of the American financial system, its capital markets. It helps fund the enormous trade deficits and government deficits in America. And it is also used widely as because it is the reserve currency. Reducing access to the reserve currency is often used in economic sanctions or coercive diplomacy. So that's what a reserve currency is and why it matters to the United States. What has happened recently that has made everyone flip out about the possible threat to the US dollar's status as a reserve currency? Well, in the last few weeks or months, there have been a raft of announcements about countries increasing their trade in their own national currencies and their reduced use of the US dollar. Russia and China have greatly expanded their trade in national currencies and have made announcements about that at the recent summit between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Brazil and China have made a major announcement that they will conduct their trade, and China is Brazil's largest trading partner, in Chinese currency or in their national currencies rather than in the US dollar. India and China, that is, whatever that is, roughly 40% of the world's population, have announced a similar agreement that they will trade in their currencies, not the US dollar. And India has announced similar arrangements with 18 other countries, including Germany and Russia. Saudi Arabia has made announcements that it will sell oil to China and to other states in not in US dollars, but in renminbi or yuan. And some African states have made similar announcements. And the Southeast Asian states, the ASEAN states have discussed at an ASEAN ministers meeting reducing their reliance on the US dollar as well. Indonesia, Malaysia and Thailand actually have a plan for settling trade and debts between those countries in their own currencies rather than in the US dollar. And the Malaysian leader, Anwar Ibrahim, has proposed an Asian monetary fund and received support from China for the exploration of that idea, as well as direct settlement of debts and trade in those national currencies as well. Even France has agreed to buy LNG in yuan rather than in US dollars. And reportedly, the formal association of the BRICS nations, BRICS, at its leaders meeting in later this year, is going to be considering kind of a formal proposal to establish an alternative reserve currency system that is sort of stabilised against a basket of commodities in simple terms. And what's more, so that's a lot of announcements there. We've got Russia, China, Brazil, India, ASEAN, Saudi Arabia, Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe, including France and Germany, all reducing their exposure to the US dollar. What's more, the Chinese government, the world's largest holder of US dollar as a foreign exchange reserve, is reportedly reducing its reserves, selling off US dollars. And the Bank of Japan has, since late 2022, been repatriating US Treasury bonds. In fact, it's reduced its holdings by 20%. And Japan is the world's largest holder of US Treasury bonds. And most importantly, the key commodity of oil, I guess the lifeblood of the economic system, and the key commodity of oil is now really being traded as a result of these set of announcements outside of the US dollar for the first time since the early 1970s. As a result, we've had this raft of commentary about the fall of the US dollar, or another term that's used is de-dollarization, less reliance on the US dollar in the global economic system. Now, there have been predictions of the fall of the US dollar before, the fall of the US dollar as reserve currency. So we don't want to be just sort of talking about the sky falling down for no good reason. In fact, in the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, the loss of US dollar dominance was a serious concern for many people, many leaders around the world. And the truth is that the share of the US dollar in global foreign exchange reserves has fluctuated over time. In 1978, it was 85%. That fell to a little under half, 46% in 1992, before bouncing back to around 70%. But over the last 25 years, there has been a steady decline. And from 2016 to today, it fell from 65% to approximately 59% at the moment. And that's likely to fall further with all these recent decisions. So although the fact that there have been speculations about the fall of the dollar before, and it didn't happen, leads some commentators to say, well, nothing's going to change anytime soon, it does seem that perhaps this crisis is a bit different. And one of the things that is different about it is that the economic sanctions imposed on Russia during the, in response to the invasion of Ukraine included a seizure of the Russian central bank's foreign reserve. And this has created a bit of wariness around the world around the security or safety of holding national foreign reserves in US dollars. and perhaps also has made many countries around the world a bit tentative of the way in which America uses the dollar as a weapon in economic diplomacy. During the week, Jeffrey Sachs, the distinguished international economist, said that we will definitely be in a different global monetary system in 10 years or within a period of 10 years. So it does seem that there are big changes underway. But does that mean that the US dollar will be replaced by the renminbi, that US will no longer be number one and that China will be number one, as Donald Trump says? Or does it mean that a more balanced, multipolar system will emerge? For that, we really need to look a little bit more closely at the history of this institution that we know as the global reserve currency. Now, the history of the global reserve currency, I think, is an interesting case of how sometimes when people talk about history, they take a unique current arrangement, like the fact that the US dollar is currently the global reserve currency, and they sort of project that back into time to assume that the world has always had a thing called the global reserve currency, and that the world system has always been like that. There's always one dominant empire and all that sort of thing. And so the common story that you'll hear about the history of the US dollar and the global reserve currency follows that pattern a little bit. Really, the United States dollar formally became the global reserve currency after World War II, and before then it was kind of the British pound, backed by the gold standard, and that sort of stretched back all the way to maybe the 1700s sometime, when former dominant European empires like the Dutch or the Spanish provided the world's global reserve currency. You can even consult that source of historical myths, Wikipedia, and find that in the 5th century BC, the Greek drachma was the reserve currency for the world. I think a little bit of thought about the real history of the world and the real reach of those countries will quickly tell you that that is complete nonsense. But there simply wasn't that kind of world economy, that kind of global reach of the city-states of Greece in the 5th century. So reserve currency is often it's a kind of a descriptive convention sometimes rather than a hard legal reality. And the accounts of reserve currency in sort of popular discussion of economics or popular discussion of geopolitics often doesn't really reflect a true global history. Certainly the Spanish silver trade from the 16th century linked Spain, most of Europe, the Americas, Philippines and China, but the realities of the economies of the world at that time simply do not support the description of this as a global reserve currency. Even if you look closely at the real global history of the 19th and 20th centuries, you'll quickly find out that it's quite different to the usual account of Pax Britannica's financial security of the pound sterling and the gold standard. The British Empire's pound sterling wasn't really the predecessor of the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency. Britain was certainly a major financial power in the 19th century, but there was no real global currency. Germany challenged it, as did America. And the gold standard, the famous gold standard, which back the value of the reserve currency, did not operate worldwide. India operated on a silver-based system. India, which, in the 19th century was a imperial possession of Britain, was operating on a different currency standard. China operated on a different currency standard. And the Americas and South America, the Americas, both North and South, were something of a wild west. Indeed, the gold standard really only emerges in Europe in the last 30 years of the 19th century. And its success was underpinned to some degree by the happy discovery, extraction, and perhaps not so happy exploitation of the enormous gold deposits from British colonies, including Australia and South Africa, especially from the 1890s when talk of the gold standard became so influential. In summary, there was, if you like, before World War II or before World War I, a bit of a multipolar system of finance, just in the way we talk about the multipolar world today. For example, in 1890, the British Barings Bank, a major bank, instrumental in the British Empire, and I think some of those South African gold mines and diamond mines, the British Barings Bank collapsed in a major collapse in 1890, and it was actually French and Russian state banks that bailed out the British financial system. The historian Jürgen Osterhammel, in a fabulous book, which is like a global history of the 19th century, says that in the world as it existed before 1914, there was a greater convergence of interests and spirit of cooperation in the field of monetary policy than in diplomacy and military affairs. There was an informal system of international cooperation, of a kind of a balance of power, a kind of multipolar financial system. But World War I really blew this system apart, to the great advantage not of Britain, but of America. The European powers engaged in a massive war, and an increasingly desperate war in which they wanted to, land a knockout blow against their enemies, became deeply financially indebted to America, which until the last year or a bit less than a year of the war was not a party to the war, but was certainly a party to the loans to the combatants in the war. In a 1917 memo to the British Treasury, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes wrote that we as in the British, have made a fetish of the gold standard. We have taken immense pride in it to point out the depreciation of the German exchanges, and the stability of our own has been our favourite form of propaganda. And he looked at dismay at how the British had been sucked in, I guess, by their own propaganda about the gold standard and the continued dominance of Britain as a financial power, when in reality during World War I, America was doing a bit of a judo flip on the European empires and establishing its financial dominance of the world. In fact, Keynes, who was at this point sort of, heavily involved in various diplomatic activity within the British government, complained that the US Woodrow Wilson administration was relishing how the British and Entente powers, France, etc., were being reduced, quote, to complete financial helplessness and dependence. And this is a remarkable story that is really told in Adam Tooze's book, the deluge, the Great War, and the remaking of global order, which I think I might have mentioned last week, and I might have also referred to in my Substack, jeffrich.substack.com, which you can subscribe to free if you want to get a weekly newsletter from me. But if that complete financial helplessness and dependence of Britain on America was established during World War I, World War II totally established American dominance of the world economy. And it was in that context, at the end of World War II, that the US dollar became the global reserve currency. By 1945, the US did not only dominate the finances of the world, it had an unprecedented and likely never to be repeated dominance of the world economy. I think it had something like more than 60% of the world's GDP. And it was in the last years of World War II at the 1944 Bretton Woods conference that the USA negotiated the establishment of the US dollar as the formal reserve currency of the world under the system established under the Bretton Woods Agreement, including that established the IMF and the World Bank. The US government guaranteed other central banks that they could sell their US dollar reserves at a fixed rate for gold, and the US gold deposits in Fort Knox were the notional guarantee of that standard. Interestingly, our friend John Maynard Keynes and the British government proposed a different system that I will talk about in the third segment of the podcast, the fragment of the burning archive. But it's the sheer scale and dominance of the economic empire established at the end of World War II by America that is, historian John Darwin in After Tamerlan says, is on an absolutely unprecedented scale. And he says that above all, it was the American dollar convertible into gold, which supplied the universally accepted reserve currency on which the great trade expansion of the 50s and 60s depended. This conferred on America extraordinary soft power of economic and cultural influence that underwrote the hard power of strategic might. No country that relied on a trading currency could risk Washington's displeasure, lest in moments of strain the support of the dollar might be withheld. And since 1945 and the early 1950s, there have really been, I guess, three big events or crises that have changed how the reserve currency has operated. First, in 1971, the US President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold and thus created what's called created a fully fiat global reserve currency system. Fiat currency being government fiat declares this currency is worth this much rather than it being backed against a metallic standard like gold. And Nixon's change to the convertibility of the US dollar for gold was partly a response to some of the economic strains in America driven by the war spending related to Vietnam War and the arms race with the Cold War conflicts with the Soviet Union and with China, and also the growth in social spending during the 1960s, the Great Society initiatives and that sort of thing, as America slowly discovered the concept of a welfare state. Around the same time, in the early 1970s, there was an enormous energy crisis, the formation of OPEC, and the agreement to trade oil internationally in the US dollar. This was the emergence of the petrodollar that put a floor, if you like, or a very large barrel of oil under the price and volume of trade in the US dollar. And this key decision, which kind of, replaced a metallic standard with a oil standard for the value of the dollar, is why some recent decisions to trade oil in renminbi, rupee and rubles matter so much. The change by Nixon to the making the US dollar a kind of a floating fiat currency rather than a gold standard currency led to some inflation and floating currencies and discussions around freeing up global capital flows of the 1980s. Something I remember very well. The Australian dollar was floated in whatever it was, 1983 or 1984. So the second big change since 1945 was really in the 1990 or in the early 1990s. So then we have the rise of Japan as a potential challenge to American economic dominance, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the absorption of all those states into the world economy, the growth of the European Union, and the full entry of China into the world economy. In the early 1990s, Japan actually proposed an Asian monetary fund, like I think Malaysia has recently done. And in the 1990s, China's entry into the world market was particularly important. It, however, did not want to be suborned to American dollar dominance, and so it established a strategy where it pegged its currency to the value of the US dollar, which underpinned the sort of Chinese path of development, very export-led path of development that also meant China gradually accumulated huge reserves of US dollars of foreign exchange, that in effect China was exporting capital to the US dollar, including buying US government bonds. And this created a kind of fear of imbalance in the world economy, what government officials in the United States called the balance of financial terror. Sell-offs could wreck America and they could wreck China. And it was as if the world had escaped the Cold War, and with its fear of mutually assured destruction by nuclear weapons, to enter a long simmering economic war or hot peace between China and America, where there was the ever-present threat of mutually assured economic destruction. And the 1990s was very much a decade of financial crises and related to this whole system of foreign exchange reserves and US dollar pegs on national currencies. There was a crisis in 1994 in Mexico, in 1997 in Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia and Thailand, in 1998 in Russia, in 1999 in Brazil, and in 2001 in Argentina. It was not a terribly stable system. Then the third big event was the crisis of 2007-2008, leading into the Eurozone crisis for the next few years. And in the lead up to that crisis, the US dollar reserve currency dominance was a key issue. When the crisis happened, Lehman's Bank collapsed and all that sort of thing, it provoked a lot of debate around the world about the status of the US dollars as the reserve currency of the world and the economic dominance of the world's financial systems by the United States. All those countries of the world that had suffered through the financial crises of the 1990s were now a little bit sick of lectures from the IMF and the World Bank and feckless American bankers who appeared to be exporting more instability to the world. It was really time to review global governance of financial institutions, United Nations institutions, security institutions, and the US dollar itself. At the United Nations, the then French president in 2008, Nicolas Sarkozy, spoke and said that, and I quote, "The world is no longer a unipolar world with one superpower, nor is it a bipolar world with the East and the West. It's a multipolar world now." So this world needed new institutions, and among them was a different system of global reserve currency. In 2009, the governor of the Bank of China, Zhao Zhaochuan, wrote a paper that proposed, in fact, a different financial system, a different system for international reserve currency. He posed the question, what kind of international reserve currency do we need to secure global financial stability and facilitate world economic growth? And he noted that the acceptance of credit-based national currencies as major international reserve currencies, i.e. US dollar as global reserve currency, as is the case in the current system, is, quote, a rare special case in history. His proposals led to a formal proposal from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development to actually establish a kind of multinational reserve currency system. But the US fought off these proposals tooth and nail. Nobel Prize winner Barack Obama really did not want to see the advantage of the US dollar and pursued, if you like, an America First policy, not a multipolar world policy. And what's more, he increasingly used the US dollar status in economic sanctions, growingly so after 2008 with the sort of Georgia crisis and then Ukraine crises and all that sort of thing. Donald Trump escalated the trade war with China, regardless of those fears of mutually assured destruction or the balance of financial terror. And then Joe Biden unleashed the dogs of economic war on Russia, raiding the Russian central bank and destroying global trust in the Western rules-based order of finance and in the security of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. And so we are in the place we are today. So when we look at the history of debates on the US dollar, debates or the history of reserve currencies in the global monetary system, it's important to sort of put aside the cliched stories of Pax Americana and the dollar empire, where the status of the global reserve currency is sort of passed down as the crown of the universal empire from Greece and Rome to Spain and Britain and then to America. And we sort of need to look at the long, complex, conflict-ridden history of international monetary systems from a truly global perspective. We need to look at how the unique circumstances of trade, resources, politics, finance, and war changed currency systems and changed pressures on those systems over time. And we need to realize that the US dollar's unique privileges and unique status as the world's currency is a rare special case in history. Global monetary systems are, just like international orders, perhaps returning to their natural multipolar state. It may be that the US dollar will not fall and the RMB will replace it in the kind of fairy tales of Donald Trump and Steve Bannon, nor will a single digital currency be imposed by the World Economic Forum and some of the sort of conspiracy theories of the world. It's not really a case with the currency system of who is number one or of a zero-sum game. Maybe, as the economic historian Luca Fantacci from Italy has said, author of The End of Finance, that we might see fragmentation of the international monetary system with several currency areas that compete and several strong currencies that maintain local regional hegemony. The US dollar might become the backer, if you like, of the financial system. Perhaps the Indian and the Chinese and the Russian, the BRICS nations may well become currencies that back the real economy, trade, the manufacturing and commodities. And it also might pay to peer into the burning archive, the cultural heritage of the world, and look again at that alternative proposal generated in part by our friend John Maynard Keynes at the Bretton Woods Conference, a proposal that might have been better attuned to a multipolar rather than a unipolar American-dominated world. So at that conference in 1944 and a couple of years before, in a paper he co-authored with a person called Shoemaker, who if you join my Substack, my weekly newsletter Substack at jeffrich.substack.com, that's jeffrich.substack.com, you'll find a link there to this original paper from, I think it's 1943, that actually proposed a multilateral system of currency and clearinghouse for international trading. But at that conference, John Maynard Keynes actually proposed a kind of a supranational, multilateral, multipolar system of international finance or currency called the Bancor, which was a combination of bank and the French word for gold, or. But as it happened, his proposal was rejected and the US proposal for the dollar empire prevailed. The system proposed by Keynes would have had some different features to the Bretton Woods system that was ultimately implemented, including an international unit of account that was different from all the national currencies, and a way of distributing readjustments between debtor and creditor countries. And there was also some criterion to avoid chronic differences in the trade accounts of countries and correct exchange rates accordingly. Chronic differences such as the long-standing American trade deficit. And I don't want to pretend that I fully understand John Keynes's proposal, but in effect, in a recent blog post on the LSE, London School of Economics blog, the historian Ed Tout, or the economist Ed Tout, I'm not quite sure what his discipline is, explains that under Keynes' scheme there was to be one world central bank, the International Clearing Union. All member nations would be given an annual quota of Bancor, the bank's currency, proportionate to their share of world trade. The distribution would be managed by a board of trustees. Any country's balance of payments which slipped into deficit or surplus would be either debited or credited in Bancor until the balance had been restored. In theory, all countries would be incentivised to keep their trade in goods and services balanced, foregoing beggar thy neighbour trade policies, which had led to the problems of the 1930s, and to manage hot money, or financial speculation if you like, the kind of thing that caused so much trouble in the 1990s and the 2000s, and to some degree also the 1980s, and perhaps even the 2020s. Financial stability would be maintained through member central banks having fixed but flexible exchange rates between nations, and all currencies fixed to Bancor, with Bancor fixed to gold. The maintenance of these rates, the issuing of Bancor, and the controlling of world gold reserves would each be the responsibility of the governing board of the International Clearing Union, a technocratic elites, which Keynes assumed would be largely serving British and American interests. Now, that was not the path that was chosen, and Americans and the IMF tend to like to portray Keynes as a defender of British imperial interests, and his intellectual opponent was a man called Harry White, a self-made man who rather did not like Keynes's aristocratic and famously gay style, and his Bloomsbury intellectual irony, and perhaps Keynes was his own worst enemy there. He said of his proposal, the Bancor proposal, that the proposal is complicated and novel and perhaps utopian in the sense that not that it is impracticable, but that it assumes a higher degree of understanding of the spirit of bold innovation and of international cooperation and trust than it is safe or reasonable to assume. So perhaps that's what riled up Harry White and the Americans so much. They maybe thought Keynes was just a bit of an intellectual snob. But on the other hand, perhaps John Maynard Keynes, who, as we have seen through this program, had seen the Americans under the Woodrow Wilson administration flip the tables on Britain in World War I, and had seen the Americans late into the war, not with the scale of death in the Soviet Union, 27 million people, or China, 14 million people, but yet profiting majorly from World War II. Perhaps he was wise to what the American rules-based order was really about, money. In 2009, the Chinese governor of this Chinese central bank, who I quoted before, Zhao Chan, actually described Keynes's proposal as far-sighted and visionary. And he and many people around the world have in recent years also gone back to that proposal from John Maynard Keynes as inspiration for a different kind of currency system. Let's call it a multipolar currency system rather than the unipolar US dollar empire. In 2023, it's probably not John Maynard Keynes' exact idea that's driving the BRICS countries in their development of a alternative multipolar currency system, but it is perhaps the spirit of a multipolar system that is being embedded in their proposal, even though the actual specific technical details of the economics may be quite different and better fitted to the unique circumstances facing the world today. We will see over the course of weeks and months and years ahead. But I think as I bring the program to a close, while Americans might bewail their number one status, as they might complain about how other countries trading in their own currencies is compromising the interests of Americans. The rights of Americans, as the White House spokesperson said, hopefully the world outside America can rise to John Maynard Keynes' challenge and devise a better idea for a national currency or for an international system of reserve currencies fitted to our unique circumstances, suited to the changing multipolar world that we live in, and that embodies what John Maynard Keynes described as a utopian wish, a spirit of international cooperation and trust. So that's the end of my program today. Fascinating issue, and I hope it's helped you understand what's going on with all this debate around the US dollar empire, the US dollar's status as a reserve currency. Again, reiterate, I'm just a retired government official and, lifelong student of history. I can't offer you financial advice as to what to do in these circumstances. And but whatever it is, you should keep a calm head and look to the realities of history and not some of the myths that are spoken about it, and perhaps cling to some of that hope with that John Maynard Keynes expressed back in 1944, that we could find a spirit of bold innovation in the world. Just a reminder that I'd love it if you shared the podcast with your friends or within your social media networks. Leave us a review. If you check out my YouTube channel, you can leave me a comment there. I'm also posting these podcasts as podcasts on YouTube, and you can also subscribe to my weekly newsletter where I offer 7 glimpses of the multipolar world for 7 days and expand on some of the details that I talk about in the podcast. And you can do that by going to jeffrich.substack.com. And you can sign up to my weekly newsletter, free weekly newsletter. And if you choose, you can also upgrade your subscription, support me, and get some extra content from me every month. Okay, until next time, I hope you have a good Easter, and do remember, what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.